But he toyed with this idea of being a cannibal. When I first started visiting him, I would get stories from some of the guards. And one of the guards mentioned about how when they first brought him in, Jeff would hang a sign up on a cell that said, "Cannibals Anonymous meeting tonight." And that's just dark humor, you know. Or if a guard looked particularly nervous standing around him, he was whispered just loud enough for the guard to hear, "I bite." You know, that's just dark humor again, you know, just playing with a whole lot of it. When you've been sentenced to 15 life sentences, 987 years in Wisconsin, and if you ever outlived that, you still had a life sentence in Ohio to serve yet. You don't have much hope of reforming. You don't have much hope of getting better or improving or anything like that. So he didn't have much motivation at first to be a good inmate, to be a good person. If he got in trouble, he would sneer back at the guards, "What are you going to do? Add more time? I mean, how much more can you hurt me? You've already gotten me beyond anything I could possibly live through. I don't really care anymore at all." So we have a little bit of that. There are parts of his story we really didn't want to hear, but Jeff needed to confess. And so when the officers found these things, he began confessing. And he confessed and confessed, and he spent several hours confessing. And for him, the confession was cathartic. He admitted killing 17 men. It is not that he murdered so many, but it is the way in which he did it that defies understanding. Our minds cannot comprehend such behavior in the United States. As I said, if this had occurred in Borneo among heathen savages, we might have not been bothered by it at all. But it was still a tragedy, but not our tragedy. But this was something we had to deal with then and there. So how do you feel about the way bad truth is revealed? Is there too much too soon that we have a hard time believing it? I can remember being taught how to tell someone his loved one has died. You don't just come out and say your loved one has died. They have a hard time accepting that truth if you did it that way. First, you build up to the awful moment. You have to make them sit down and tell them that there's been a terrible accident, that it's a very bad accident. It involves their loved one, that they were hurt very badly. And finally, you tell them that the person did not survive. But if you dump it on them all too quickly, they have trouble dealing with the reality. And yet they still need to hear the truth no matter how bad it is. Well, a lot of times I think the trouble with the story of Jeffrey Dahmer is that it came on us so fast, so quickly, so suddenly. And we just had a hard time understanding and accepting what we're talking about. 17 men. Well, that's not the most. There are others who have killed more. There are others who have done worse things than what Jeffrey Dahmer did. But Jeffrey Dahmer has become kind of the symbol of evil for many of us. I've observed that truth leans toward the light, seeking exposure. There are some things that we can do that we can keep a secret for a time, but because truth yearns for the light, eventually the truth will be made known, even the most horrible, awful, disgusting things of truth, like those hidden by Jeffrey Dahmer. Just as Jeffrey grew to hate the lies and the acts of hiding the truth, so will we. I've known men who eagerly confess sexual affairs that they've had in the past, just for the relief of not having to confess the lying, not to continue lying any longer. Lying is a burden too hard to bear. The truth is our friend, even when terrible things are revealed. Once we understand the truth, then we can make the proper response to it. In Jeff's case, we can go about making right what has done wrong. But before we can do that, we are constrained to ask very difficult questions. We must ask how Jeff's story came about. What were the influences of his life that can account for his behavior? Because we cannot comprehend his actions, we are forced to question his sanity. Is there any kind of explanation that helps us understand why he would do such things? And I have a chapter on sanity, by the way. I spent some time with a counselor, a doctor of psychology in our congregation, and we talked quite a bit about sanity. And the interesting thing is that when she was studying for her doctorate, they spent a great deal of time talking about how do you determine sanity and so forth. And there are certain rules and regulations regarding sanity. And Jeff didn't live up to the meaning of insanity at all, even though many people felt like you can't explain these things without describing it as being insane. Well, it doesn't fit what we understand what insanity is all about. She even told a story, I'm talking about the doctor now, of where the professor gave them an anonymous story of something that happened with someone, and then began to go into details of it. And then they all concluded at the end of that study that this person was not insane, this person was sane, then revealing afterward, well, the person they were talking to that they'd studied was Jeffrey Dahmer. So he doesn't fit their rules for insanity, and yet it's hard for us to comprehend how these things come about. Well, I have a chapter called Evil Urges, which tries to explain what the psychologist said about what caused Jeffrey Dahmer to do these things. I begin by asking this question: what do you do with an urge? I suppose it depends upon the kind of urge you have. If you just want some ice cream cone on a hot day, well, that isn't so bad. Go ahead and indulge yourself. But what if the urges are something you shouldn't have or you shouldn't do? Again, it depends upon what we're talking about. Eating fried foods when you have a weight problem or lying to save face is generally not considered terribly important matters. But what if the urge is to steal or to hurt someone? What if the urge was sexual in nature and involved inappropriate matters, such as another man's wife or someone engaged to be married to someone else? What if you find yourself attracted sexually to little children? What do you do then? Well, most of us would say, well, you work hard to control your urges. There are some things you cannot have, no matter how badly you want them. These are lessons we're learning as little children. We generally understand this principle socially. If you find yourself attracted to someone of the opposite gender, but then learn that they are socially unavailable, married, for instance, engaged, or committed to someone else, you're able to take yourself out of that picture, and we often do that when we realize that. Oh, it may hurt a little bit, but you'll get over it. It would be morally wrong to insist on having your way with someone when they had no interest in you. To force yourself upon other people against their will is considered a great social sin. Jeffrey Dahmer fought with personal urges. When he was 14 years old, he began to believe that he was a homosexual. He was not attracted to girls as much as he thought he should. He started having sexual fantasies. Is that so surprising? Who doesn't have sexual fantasies when puberty arises? But his imagination was unusual in that he began to think of violence intermingled with sex. As time went by, his mental agonies only got worse. He didn't know how to tell anyone about it. Who would listen to him? His parents were beginning a long and bitter relationship that would ultimately end in divorce. He couldn't talk to them. There was no one he felt comfortable enough with to disclose such frightening images, so he simply kept these things to himself. Can you identify with that? I certainly can. There have been times I've had terrible, terrible secrets that I thought were the worst terrible things in the world, and who can I tell? And if I do tell, how will it change how they feel about me? And I'm not unusual in that way. All of you have been there. All of you know what I'm talking about. And it doesn't matter how serious the issue is. To you, it's very serious. Others may not consider it serious, but to you, it's very serious. And sometimes it can be very serious. At the age of 15, Jeff began to collect and dissect dead animals he found by the roadside. The sight of their internal organs aroused him. Somehow there began to arise from within him a desire to have sex with dead people, and there was also fantasies about killing and dismemberment. These thoughts tormented him and shocked him and preyed on his mind. Somewhere during this period of his life, he began to think about killing. Once he observed a jogger in the neighborhood, and he thought about killing the jogger. And several times over several days, he waited in the bushes for the jogger with a baseball bat, planning to attack him and have sex with him while the man was unconscious. But the jogger never showed up. But it was an experience and anticipation that Jeff would never forget, and that would help to mold and shape the future for him. At age 17, he began to drink heavily, and this became a pattern for his life for several years. By 1978, his parents were divorcing. His father moved out of the house, and his mother left with his younger brother to live in Wisconsin. They were living in Ohio at the time. Jeff was left alone at age 18, abandoned by everyone he ever cared for. They were wallowing in their own problems, and no one even bothered to ask him about his. This is the setting of his first murder. He was driving along a road toward his home in the early evening when he saw a hitchhiker near his house. Stephen Mark Hicks, age 19, was on his way home from a rock concert. Jeff turned the car around, picked him up, and took him home. They talked, and they drank some beer, and then Jeff hit Stephen in the head and knocked him out. Later that night, he dismembered the body and put it into garbage bags. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he put the bags in his car and intended to take them to the dump. And as he drove, he was stopped by a police officer for driving left of center on the road. When asked about the bags in the back seat, he said they contained garbage he had forgotten to take to the dump. The policeman never checked the bags, and Jeff returned home with the body. He hid the bags containing the body parts under his house for 2 weeks. Later, he crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the woods behind his house. No one found out about his urges or what he had done. No one would know until his confession several years later. After a semester in college, he joined the Army in 1979, but was discharged in 1981 for alcohol abuse. Shortly after that, he moved in with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. She was a very religious person who read the Bible daily, and this had a positive influence on Jeff for a short time, but still he wrestled with his urges. Eventually, he began to act upon them. In 1982, Jeff was convicted of disorderly conduct after being caught exposing himself to teenage boys. For the next several years, he tried to ignore his recurring fantasies of sex and mutilation. But when the urges became strong, he used a male mannequin to stimulate homosexual encounters. And when his grandmother discovered the device, he was forced to discard it. But his necrophilia urges kept getting stronger. In 1985, he started going to bathhouses on Milwaukee's east side, where he would drug his partners and have sex with them while they were unconscious. He began reading the obituaries to find dead bodies. In one instance, he went to the funeral and was so attracted to the corpse that he later went to the cemetery to dig up the grave, but the ground was already frozen. But this moment represented a turning point for him. One of the, Michael McCain, the Milwaukee County District Attorney, said of Jeff regarding this time in his life, he made a conscious decision to no longer resist his evil urges, evil impulses, but to rather to yield to them. After this, there was no God, there was no law that could control him. He became a law unto himself, and that's what the district attorney said. It's interesting how insightful that language is. As I said, we all struggle from time to time with evil urges. And we struggle. We don't know quite how to deal with these things. As long as you struggle alone, you're almost always guaranteed to lose. I have a sermon that I titled, and the best part of the sermon, by the way, is a title. And the title is The Healing Nature of Confession. It was built upon an experience I had when I first started preaching. And I was dealing with a young homecoming queen who was baptized in one of our efforts and so forth. And she was a beautiful young girl and just felt wonderful that she was part of our congregation. But she had a boyfriend with whom she'd been having sex for quite some time. And he was baptized later on too, to basically win her back to him because she had rejected him. And after a while she gave in to him and then confessed to me that she started having sex again with him. Well, this is wrong. You can't be doing this. And so I tried to encourage her to openly confess this. And, oh, she couldn't do that. In fact, she just quit the church and gave up her faith because of this thing about confession. And I remember thinking long and hard about that and wrote the sermon, The Healing Nature of Confession, that you have to believe that confession will heal you. That's a dynamic I've believed ever since. And in my counseling experiences with people, I sometimes have to come back to that we live a confessing life if we're going to live a healthy life. A confessing life is not to be ashamed of ourselves, but to openly admit what we struggle with. Because by openly admitting it, we're asking for help from others to help us overcome it. But as long as you keep it secret, you simply encourage it to continue on. And that's what Jeff was doing. He had these terrible stories, these terrible secrets, and he kept them secret, and no one knew. In 9 years after his first murder, Jeff met his second victim in a gay bar. Jeff and Stephen W. Tuumi, age 28, went to the Ambassador Hotel and rented a room. Jeff drugged Stephen to unconsciousness and just intended to spend the night with him. But when he awoke in the morning, his roommate was dead. Jeff had no memory of how the man died. He had blacked out. He assumed he must have beaten the man to death. Taking the body home, he dismembered it and placed the pieces in plastic trash bags and put them on the garbage. From that point, his obsession with death, dismembership, and sex went into full swing. By the way, the reason he confessed to 17 men and was only charged with 15 deaths in Wisconsin, the 16th one was Ohio, was that this one here, they never could find any evidence that this man ever existed with Jeffrey Dahmer. No one could find him, but he had so destroyed the evidence that they couldn't charge him with that one. So that's the one person he wasn't charged with, even though he confessed to it. His next two victims, James Doxeter, age 14, and Richard Guerrero, is a Hispanic name, age 25, were killed at his grandmother's home. In 1988, Jeff fondled and photographed an underage male who escaped and went to the police. Jeff was convicted of second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. While waiting sentencing at home, he killed another victim, Anthony Sears, age 24. Out on probation after serving 10 months of a 12-month sentence, he moved back in with his grandmother. In the spring of 1990, he moved to the Oxford Apartments. He took steps to safeguard his privacy by installing a fake security system with a camera. He also purchased a small freezer. Feeling secure in his apartment, the pace of the killings escalated. 11 years had passed between the first murder and the fifth murder, but the final 12 all took place in a little more than a year in this apartment. In fact, as the murders progress, there become so many of them that he's literally tripping over body parts. They're just going so fast. As the body count mounted, his life began to come apart. When the neighbors began to complain about the smells coming from his apartment, Jeff said it was the water he used in his aquarium. In another instance, someone complained to the police about the odors, but the police went to the wrong apartment. Jeff had a disposal problem because he had taken too many victims before he had gotten rid of the remains. And if there was anything about Jeffrey Dahmer that went out of control, it was at the very end. During the last few killings, he drank too much, took too many victims, and let his job responsibilities go. Jeff was fired from his job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory just 2 weeks before his exposure and arrest. At the same time, he was evicted from his apartment. He gave up thinking he could keep all of his crimes a secret when he got the eviction notice. He was going to be caught, and he knew it. The nightmare was all coming to an end. There would either be suicide or be an arrest. Dr. Fred Berlin, a psychiatrist who examined Jeff, diagnosed him as a necrophiliac, being erotically aroused by thinking about or interacting with dead bodies. The necrophilia caused Jeff to have an irresistible urge, which ultimately made him kill again and again. Dr. Berlin states there was something driving him to act, that under certain circumstances, because of these circumstances, he can defer acting, but could not and was unable to stop entirely. Dr. Park Dietz, MD, a forensic psychiatrist who also studied Jeffrey Dahmer, agreed that Jeff was a necrophiliac, but he doesn't believe that necrophilia alone made him a serial killer. What he did have, said Dr. Dietz, was 3 problems that accounted for how he could do such horrible things. First was his sexual deviations, the second was his alcoholism, and the third was a personality that was such that he really couldn't develop the kinds of appropriate human relationships that would have allowed him to fulfill his sexual desires without crime. In his book, at the very end of the book, this particular book here, which is the second printing of the book and was put out after Jeff's death, Mr. Lionel quotes me talking about, Mr. Lionel Dahmer quotes me talking about how Jeff was saved by grace and so forth, and makes mention of the fact that in the last 6 months of his life, Jeff's personality was changing drastically. So much so, his father noticed he could begin to relate to people again. And that's what this doctor was talking about. He'd gotten to the point where he couldn't even relate to people. Couldn't talk to them. Perhaps the most revealing explanation about Jeff